Thank you very much. We are going to continue with our debate. Next item on the agenda is, please, those who are not going to participate in the debate that are talking in the corridors, you can continue your talks outside. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is Parliament's statements, ceasefire in Gaza, the urgent need to release the hostage, to end the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and to pave the way for a two-state solution. En primer lugar, tiene la palabra en representación del Grupo Popular el diputado.
The first speaker on behalf of the EPP group is Mr. López Istúriz White.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon to all.
There is no doubt that this is an important time for us. Thank you for those who collaborated to have this ceasefire. The ceasefire agreement in Gaza, whose implementation started yesterday, was our end goal from the very beginning. Our priority was always the liberation of the hostages held captive by the terrorist group Hamas and the alleviation of the challenging situation faced by the civil population in Gaza. Finally, this can be achieved. Our EPP group should be proud. In these last 15 months, we have been able to act with responsibility, stepping up to the complexity of the conflict. While some choose the ideological, opportunistic and sometimes anti-Semitic approach, we have shown leadership. And this Parliament has shown also leadership. I would like to thank President von der Leyen and President Metsola for their guidance. In face of the brutal tragedy of the 7th of October terrorist attacks and the conflict that followed, they expressed our solidarity to the Israeli people and stressed our commitment to protecting the right to exist of the only democracy in the Middle East. While doing so, all they could do to help guarantee that the humanitarian assistance could be delivered to the Palestinian people and stressing out our commitment to a two-state solution. Now, it is time to develop a clearer and more coherent approach to the region. A two-state solution is a goal that we all share, but not recognizing one state without consensus. To strike points in domestic politics. This is absolutely irresponsible. To those who still believe that we should negotiate some sort of new agreement with Iran, wake up. Iran is behind all of this, and we cannot allow this to continue. And we have to identify who was the beginning of all this. That will be the starting of the solution of this problem. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker on behalf of the Socialist Group is Mr. Maniatis.
Thank you very much. After 15 months of this conflict, where Gaza has been brought to the point of humanitarian catastrophe and where many civilians have lost their lives, the ceasefire and the release of the hostages is a first glimmer of hope. I hope that it will be a first sign of freedom in the whole region, and let's hope that the plan will be fully implemented and that all of the hostages will come home. We need to enable humanitarian aid in Gaza, and we need to put an end to the suffering of the Palestinians there. Israel must be called upon to reinstate the activities of humanitarian aid, particularly through UNRWA and the United Nations. That is important for the many refugees. And we need to ensure that international humanitarian law is observed. Now it's time to start negotiations for a sustainable peace that will be stable with a two-state solution. That is the only way that we can protect the rights of both peoples. An Israel that is recognized by its neighbors and a peaceful, independent and democratic Palestinian state. As an international community, we should put on the necessary pressure to ensure that the necessary progress is made. We need to observe international law and to have the involvement of multilateral organizations like the United Nations. For Europe, It's important to remember that the Middle East is part of our neighbourhood. Everything that happens there affects us. The European Union cannot simply be a big donor. The EU needs to take on responsibility and take the necessary initiatives. Thank you.
Colleague, on behalf of the Patriots for Europe group, Mr. Stottela.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yesterday was a great day for Romy Gonen, Emily Damari and Doron Steinbrecher and their families. Yesterday was a great day for Israel and for everybody who cares about Israel and Israelis. Yesterday was the first day of at least 4 long months during which Hamas will still be holding hostages captive, a period during which every week a handful of hostages will be released by Hamas in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, often criminals with Israeli blood on their hands. Of course, it is wonderful that at last innocent Israeli citizens are released from the grasp of Hamas. But the amount that Israel has to give in return has shown how important it is to Israel to retrieve their citizens. But it is bitter. It is bitter that the terrorists are able, in broad daylight, in the middle of a screaming crowd shouting Allahu Akbar, are able to hand over the hostages to the Red Cross staff in broad daylight. In past times, terrorist organizations were wiped off the face of the earth. Look at Al-Qaeda. There must be no role in future for Hamas in the future government of Gaza. The question is whether the Commissioner still sees it that way, and whether the Commissioners are going to do everything they can to get Hamas removed from Gaza altogether. There are still plenty of organizations and countries that support Hamas, Iran, Qatar, and so on. We need to ensure that humanitarian and medical help can reach citizens. A ceasefire is not a peace, but the hostages have to come home now.
Mr. Rosen, on behalf of the ECR group.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, hope and fear. These are the two words that come into mind when we look at the deal. New hope for the families of the hostages, that they too will see their dear ones returning home soon. New hope amongst the people of Gaza, that the bombing will come to an end and that they can start rebuilding their future. But in the meantime, there are very great concerns and, of course, fears. Fears about the fate of the hostages. How are they now? How many are still alive? And will they all really be released? Also concerns about the long-term consequences of this deal. Hamas has been weakened, it's true, but not completely defeated. Hundreds of terrorists are now being released. What consequences will that have? Are Hamas going to get a free hand again to rearm in order to prepare another 7th of October attack, rebuild their tunnels instead of looking after their population? That obviously is not what we want. The fact that there is a deal is a positive thing, but this deal requires a clear series of steps, and we too need to be involved, not just in providing support for reconstruction, but we need to support Israel in their battle against terrorism. We need to adopt measures to prevent the rearming of Hamas. We shouldn't be demanding that Israel leave the Adelphi corridor without firm guarantees that more arms won't come into the Gaza Strip, because only in this way can these fears of a repetition of the 7th of October give way to hope for a lasting peace.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. On behalf of the Renew Europe group, Madam Woutmans.
Colleagues, After 471 days of appalling violence, the ceasefire agreement is a step in the right direction, but it is just one small first step. And you feel on all sides that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to return to the use of force as soon as he possibly can. This is what he indicated yesterday. So this is not the time for Europe to sit back and fold its arms and just from the sidelines say, oh yes, we welcome the ceasefire, thank you to the US and Qatar and so on. Now is the time, colleagues, to keep up the pressure. And I hear that Europe has already made promises about deepening its association with Israel. Are these rumours true? I hope not, but of course that takes the pressure off Israel. We expect the High Representative to speak very clear and firm language on this. And the Commission isn't here today, unfortunately, but I've got three very specific questions for the Commission. First of all, send European observers. Both sides have to respect the ceasefire agreement. Secondly, ensure that all European countries carry out the international arrest warrant. And thirdly, ensure that the EU blocking statute is activated so that Europeans would be immune from any attacks by Trump. Colleagues, Trump is just being sworn in at the moment, and he is only concerned about the interests of America. We need to put European interests first, and that means the two-state solution. Thank you.
Dear colleague, on behalf of the Greens, Mr. Sondale.
Finally, a ceasefire. It doesn't justify taking hostages, but there is something which justifies the war against terrorism. Before the war, the situation in Gaza was untenable. Now it's unbearable. After 16 months of war against the civilian population, and bombing of schools, refugee camps, hospitals, Gaza is totally destroyed. The number of dead is completely incomprehensible. Now we'll start to reconstruct the world community, and the EU must take responsibility. The world community must make sure that we find the resources quickly, the necessary humanitarian aid, and to stop the Israeli ban on UNRWA. The barriers, the borders to Gaza should be opened up to aid organizations and journalists. With the war shouldn't continue. We must there'll be responsibility for what has gone wrong. When the ECC issues an arrest warrant, we should live up to it. We are undermining the rule of law. For many years, we've accepted agreements being undermined. The two-state solution is the only way to peace, but the Palestinians have only seen internal splits, occupation, violence and control. The EU's role is important. We must support and have demands. We have provided infrastructure, but it has also been destroyed. Thank you.
On behalf of the Left Group, Madame Boylan.
Thank you, Chair. The genocide in Gaza has raged for over 460 days. Tens and thousands of men, women and children have been killed, and an entire society has been levelled. And I welcome the ceasefire agreement, but we cannot return to business as usual, where the illegal occupation of Palestine is allowed to continue without any consequences for Israel. The response of the EU to the genocide, live-streamed for all to see, was reprehensible. European leaders are complicit with Israel's actions in Gaza, from those European weapons manufacturers that provided the weapons to the EU itself that provided the diplomatic and political cover. Europe has failed to stand up for human rights and international law, and its credibility is on the floor. Accountabilities for war crimes must now happen, and the work of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice must be fully supported. On the ceasefire deal itself, I welcome the return of the hostages and the Palestinians who've been arbitrarily detained by Israel. However, Dr. Hussam Abu Safaya, the director of Kamal Adwan Hospital, remains detained, and it is widely reported that his health is deteriorating due to the disgraceful treatment he is receiving from Israel. The EU must work for his immediate release. Finally, I wish to call for the repeal of the anti-UNRWA laws. There is no alternative to UNRWA. There is no plan B. The EU must use all the tools available to ensure these laws are repealed and UNRWA can continue its vital work. We must collectively work to end the illegal occupation. Saoirse dun Palestine.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Europe of Sovereign Nations Group, Mr. Schell.
Donald Trump is zurück.
Well, Donald Trump is back. He's now starting his second term of office. Viktor Orban, Mrs. Meloni, Tino Kruppala, they're all in Washington. This is a day for all of those who want for peace, freedom and democracy. Since now we have a ceasefire in Gaza, and Donald Trump made a contribution to this. He used strong words that were understood in Gaza. Yesterday, the first hostages were released after nearly 480 days of being held hostage in Gaza. Finally, the population of Gaza can breathe out. Since yesterday, Israel's Air Force stopped its bombing. The pointless killing has ended. More than 45,000 Palestinians have been killed, including many children. It is good that the war has stopped, that the guns have fallen silent. But the question is, why did this war end the very day that Donald Trump started his second term? Because no one else had an interest in ending the conflict. Donald Trump put an end to this conflict because he didn't only put pressure on Hamas, but also on the Israeli government, on Netanyahu. Biden was not prepared to do that. The ceasefire in Gaza shows that even before he takes office, Donald Trump has done more for peace than Scholz, Baerbock or von der Leyen. Mrs. von der Leyen now wants to send 20 million euros together with the 200 million that we annually transfer to the Palestinian authorities. So, nevertheless, there is hope today. The madness is coming to an end. Joe Biden is retiring, and his fans in Europe should end up taking the same route. Thank you very much.
We jump now into the second part of the debate. First speaker is Mr. Sterba. You have the floor.
Szanowny panie przewodniczący.
President, deputies, keeping hostages is a crime, a war crime that we in the European Parliament and in the world cannot tolerate. And everybody who does this needs to be taken, needs to be held responsible and tried. This is fundamental, morally and legally. And this ceasefire, which takes place now, is extremely important. And this is also a success of American diplomacy, which should be continued and protected. From the very beginning, I was in this small group of MEPs who, despite the pressure and difficulties, were involved in the issues of freeing the hostages. I was in Israel 1 month after the attack. In the kibbutz, I was there representing NATO, and I was appealing for the hostages to be freed. A Polish citizen, Alex Danzig, born in Warsaw, was among the hostages killed. But among those 33 hostages who will be freed is another Polish citizen, Oded Livsznitz. And I hope very much that he will be free soon. And I want to emphasize something. The European Union also needs to play a bigger role in solving international conflicts and building peace. This is our responsibility, our values, which tell us to protect life, freedom and human dignity. Thank you.
Nuestra siguiente oradora es la señora.
The next speaker is Ms. Halul. For the S&D, you have the floor. Thank you. Good afternoon. For the first time since the beginning of this Parliament, we are meeting in plenary to celebrate a great piece of news. The ceasefire between Hamas and Israel is a good piece of news for the thousands of innocent victims and all those who have suffered the devastating consequences of this conflict. 471 days later, 46,913 dead, 110,000 injured, displacement of 90% of the Gazan people, not to mention the thousands of Israelis killed and injured. All of this could have been avoided if we had acted with more determination much earlier. Now, we have to ensure that this ceasefire holds. I would like to recall also the lost lives of medical workers and journalists just doing their jobs. We very much welcome the release of the first 3 hostages held by Hamas and also the reunion of Palestinian prisoners with their families. Now we have to talk about the future government of Gaza. It is extremely important that Reconstruction and the UN resolutions be recognised, as well as the orders of the International Criminal Court. It is important that we in the EU should continue to work in the Middle East, that we should provide technical and financial support, including in the Gaza Strip, for reconstruction. Let us remain united. We must bear in mind that we are witnessing a historic moment for the region. We have to address this new task with hope to bring about inclusive democratic governments with the support of the citizenship in Syria, in the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon. We have to work hand in hand to achieve a two-state solution where the peoples can live side by side in peace.
Colega, el señor Tánger.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tánger Correa.
President, members, today a historic event has taken place for all of us, for the world, for the United States in particular, but also for Europe. And that is the inauguration of Donald Trump today. Another historical event was the start of the ceasefire in Gaza yesterday. That was a small step. It does not resolve the conflict, but it's a step in the right direction. And this step is largely due to Trump and his peace initiative. Friends, I want to talk about the two-state solution. That is not even a valid possibility if you can't create a viable Palestinian state. It's in 3 separate parts. 1/3 in Gaza, 1/3 in the West Bank, and another third in Jordan. So, I mean, there is absolutely no continuity within their territory. So, friends, before we fill our mouths with fine words about two-state solutions, let's try and find a viable solution first. We need a solution such as the one in Bosnia, and other solutions that have been tried elsewhere in the world. The two-state solution has always failed, and it's always been the fault of the Palestinians. Let's learn from experience and find a different solution. Thank you very much.
Señor Tánger Correa, you have 2 cards, one from Mr. Oliveira and another one from Vice President Stefanuta. Do you accept them? Do you accept them? Yeah? Okay. Mr. Oliveira, 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, President. Mr. Tánger Correa, you're telling us that Trump is a great peacemaker. And I wanted to ask you, how can you say that Donald Trump supports peace when he's the very American president who has called for investment in the arms race and creating conflicts around the world? How can you possibly say that This is the very American president that transferred the American embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. This was absolute ignorance and disrespect for the two-state solution. How can you possibly defend that? How can you say that he defends the rights of the Palestinian people? Well, thanks. It's pretty simple. In the first term of Mr. Trump, it was a peace presidency because wars ended during his term of office. There were no wars caused by his first mandate. And when you're talking about the move of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, I was there. It was simply a transfer on paper because the American embassy continues to function in Tel Aviv. What the thing in Jerusalem is more of a consulate. So it's not my problem. Thanks very much.
You have it now.
Okay, thank you. I listened to all the comments made by the right and the extreme right in the House. To deny the existence of Palestine because you said the two-state solution was a fantasy, where would you like these people to go? Where would you like the millions? Maybe push them out into the sea? How is anything but a two-state solution even reasonable in your mind? You mentioned the example of Bosnia, but Bosnia was a state altogether. How can you imagine the fate of the Palestinian people within a Balkan solution such as the one you mentioned? I think it's purely incredible to deny that the right solution is that of a two-state solution now.
Thank you, Vice President. Senor Correa.
Sorry.
Tangel Correa, you have to.
Thank you. Well, the ones who want to push someone to the sea are not the Israelis, are the Palestinians from the river to the sea, as you know. So, A. B. I didn't say I didn't want a Palestinian state. I just said that a state in these conditions is not realistic. And I mentioned Bosnia and Herzegovina because I served there, as I served in the Middle East as well, in several countries, and I know the mentality. And, of course, I was thinking about a juridical aspect of how to define the convivency. And if you see Republika Srpska and the Bosnian Federation, they are as much or almost as much apart as the several populations of Gaza, West Bank and Jordan. So I didn't know, I didn't say I don't want to. I said we have to find new solutions, just not only this two-state thing. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Tanger Correa. Our next speaker is Madame Retsionova.
Mr. President, thank you for the floor. Images from the release of the first 3 hostages must have filled everyone with joy. Everybody must have been moved. It's good that the agreement on the ceasefire and the release of the refugees happened. And our thanks go also to the outgoing American administration as well as to the incoming President Trump. However, this agreement is not black and white. The need to release hundreds of Palestinians who were often condemned for terrorism has a bitter taste, and there's a safety threat, and also the way in which Hamas released the first 3 refugees shows their real face. For months we have been hearing that there are only suffering women and children in Gaza, and now we can see that it's not the case. And terroristic Hamas is now using propaganda rhetoric. Yes, Hamas needs to continue sticking to the agreement.
Our next speaker is Madame Juveva.
It has been long, harrowing, unbearable and devastating 471 days. Long overdue, but here it is, a beam of hope. Even though it's the most hopeful I have been, I'm still worried, especially about the statements made by Benjamin Netanyahu. He is constantly stressing the ceasefire is temporary and his willingness to return to fighting in new, more forceful ways, indicating he is keen to finish the genocide he started. Meanwhile, we are also watching the Palestinians returning home, or, what's left of it. Not only there is no resemblance of life there, there isn't any means for life. So its recovery will be a long and excruciating process, and we need a sustainable solution, a true two-state solution without any illegal occupation by Israel. Moreover, we need to ensure significant and sufficient humanitarian aid to help, heal and rebuild. It's the very least we must do. And we must not forget, the tens of thousands of people that were killed in this war deserve justice. The ones responsible must and will be held responsible. Show the same level of care, colleagues.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Our next speaker is Mr. Sautori.
Finally, a ceasefire, a relief for the hostages and for the people of Gaza. But it has come far too late, after 15 months, not only of war, but of a genocide, 15 months of the moral bankruptcy of the EU and its member states, 15 months of international law not being respected and our values being trampled underfoot, 15 months which have added nothing to the task of trying to achieve peace. This ceasefire must become permanent. International law must be applied and respected. This is the only way that will allow Palestine and Israel to emerge from this deadlock. We have to haul before the International Court of Justice those responsible for genocide and call on Israel to put an end to occupation and colonization and settlements. So I call for an embargo on weapons and a suspension of the association agreement with Israel as long as Israel conducts a policy of apartheid and fails to respect international law.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Madam Hassan.
Le 17 octobre
On this 17th of October 2023, I sent a public letter to our decision makers so that they could work for justice, the freeing of the hostages and the liberation of the Palestinian people who were victims of Israeli colonialism. Now, the ceasefire that we've called for is finally arriving, despite the terrible suffering that we've seen. We have watched on our smartphones the development of this catastrophe. We have been waking up to the images of the bodies of Palestinians who've been burned, killed, slaughtered, decapitated. Too much Palestinian blood has flowed, and there's a stench of European complicity which has armed the perpetrators. Justice is not bringing in humanitarian aid and being happy about the weapons falling silent. We need justice for colonized people who have seen their homes disappear. It's also an inalienable right to self-determination that they need. Thank you.
Here is Mr. Brown.
What we really need is denazification of the State of Israel. We need to see Netanyahu and his butchers facing tribunals, and if convicted, let's hope, facing gallows. That's what we need. Mass murderers should be convicted. If not, there will be no peace. In Palestine, there will be no peace in the world. All the decent, peaceful people of this world need to see the Holocaust Haggadah, which is the main tool of Israeli and Jewish propaganda, studied, scientifically scientifically studied, not used as a tool of propaganda hybrid war. Let's ban Talmud, not TikTok. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Our next speaker is Madame Ventele.
Dear fellow Europeans, dear colleagues, whoever has met with the families of the hostages, whoever has a heart beating in their chest could feel nothing but immense joy and relief yesterday evening when the first 3 Israeli girls were released after 471 days in captivity. I would like to wholeheartedly thank all those who have worked tirelessly to make this agreement between Israel and Hamas a reality. But with Hamas, and here comes the painful truth, this agreement is a pact with the devil. The facts speak for themselves. For the release of 33 innocent Israeli hostages, 1,900 criminals of Palestinian origin and often Hamas affiliation will be freed. The cost of this agreement is extremely high in terms of Israel's security. Now a plan is on the table for steps towards the release of all hostages and a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. But the crucial question remains: who will govern the ruins of Gaza? The Biden administration has aimed at a big bargain with Saudi Arabia, including the relaunch of a diplomatic process for an independent Palestinian state. The incoming Trump administration brokered the Abraham Accords and made Prime Minister Netanyahu to agree to the current agreement, yet the future remains uncertain. Unfortunately, the EU, hampered by its divisions, is not a political player in the region, but the EU is a vital donor of humanitarian aid. And in this regard, let me be crystal clear. We cannot allow Hamas to rebuild itself in Gaza. It is time to close the tunnels permanently, to intercept the financial flows, to stop teaching children to glorify terror and to dismantle the structures that cement hatred and deny the possibility to peaceful coexistence. We cannot afford to be blind or naive any longer. Now it's time for realpolitik.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. You have 2 blue cards. One from Madame de Mirel and one from Madame Al-Salani. Do you accept them? Madame de Mirel, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you. Ms. Bentelem, thank you for allowing this question. Did I understand you right? You think this ceasefire agreement is a pact with the devil because Palestinians wrongly imprisoned have been released? Should you think that the bloodletting should continue and more people should die so that you don't have to be cynical here? Can I assume that that Mr. Merz, who wanted to supply more weapons, you just said that there aren't enough weapons being sent to the war? Isn't that just very cynical?
Ich kann leider keine Frage.
I don't see the question there, but I spoke about the balance, about innocent Israeli hostages who have been released and condemned mass murderers who've contributed to hundreds and thousands to the death of over 1,000 Israeli civilians, and this imbalance of with releasing Hamas fighters, that is a danger for the security of Israel. That's what I was pointing to.
Next blue card for Madame Al-Salani. You have 30 seconds.
Yes, now, thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Bentley. I have 2 questions. You said that there are over 1,000 Palestinian criminals. Are you aware that these people are arbitrarily detained without a trial? There are no proof of them being tried, and there are several of them who are under the age of 18 who are now being finally released. My second question is, would you condemn the Knesset members who are saying that Palestinians are animals and do not deserve human rights, as you are condemning the so-called brainwashing of Palestinian children? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madame Bentelem.
Do you want to say that you have doubts in the Israeli justice system? Is this what you want to say? I don't have these doubts. So.
It's Madam Bentley on the floor. You finished?
Puts like Madam Al-Sani into the Israeli justice system.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Madam Insir.
For 471 days, we have witnessed the aftermath of Hamas' brutal attack on innocent Israelis. And for over 50 years, we've seen the impact of an unlawful Israeli occupation that has taken countless innocent Palestinian lives and erased entire families from existence. The numbers are staggering. Over 46,000 Palestinians and 1,200 Israelis have been murdered since October 7, 2023. Each statistic represents a life, a story, a future stolen. Those standing idly by are complicit in this suffering. While we cannot undo the vast suffering endured by the victims over the past years, we have the power today to shape a better future. Let's be clear. A ceasefire is vital and must be respected by all parties. That includes Netanyahu, who continued bombing Gaza yesterday. EU countries must implement a weapon embargo against Israel. This is a demand echoed by Palestinians, but also Israeli families with loved ones, those kept hostages by Hamas. They are all desperate for an end to this horror. They want their family members alive and home. Furthermore, EU must also rally behind a two-state solution through actively engaging in the international coalition for a two-state solution and halting the expansion of violent settlements. Recent statements from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu are therefore alarming, suggesting a possible resumption of military operations. War criminals must face justice. The International Criminal Court must be allowed to operate freely and impartially. Today, 2 million Palestinians are returning to bombed areas and must urgently receive our support and not to be sent to Indonesia as the Trump administration seems to want. How many times must Palestinians be forcibly displaced from their homes before the world says enough is enough? EU must support humanitarian organizations like UNRWA and act for the lifting of the Israeli ban of the organization. It is a shame that countries as my own Sweden let Israeli far-right government dictate our actions. And finally, colleagues, the Palestinian Authority must receive the support to be able to lead the rebuild of Gaza.
Our next speaker is Mr. Kalahar.
After the barbarity of the 7th of October 2023 and the subsequent invasion of Gaza and the brutality of Israeli attacks on civilians right across Gaza, this ceasefire is welcome. Very welcome, but very late. 42,000 people dead and hostages detained in underground cellars across Gaza. We need the hostages out and we need humanitarian aid into Gaza immediately. We need international oversight to ensure that this is being carried out. But ultimately, we need a political settlement. We need a two-state solution proposal. And we need to ensure that Europe acts as an honest broker. It has been inherently dishonest in this debate for many, many years. It simply will not accept that the Palestinian people have a right to statehood, have a right to freedom, and have a right to their own destiny. So Europe must act while we have this opportunity with a ceasefire to insist on a political settlement to ensure that a two-state solution and Palestinian statehood is a priority for this House and the EU institutions as right across as well.
Thank you, Mr. Kelleher. Thank you, Mr. Kelleher. Madame Strick.
Dear Chair, after 15 months of bombings, massive killings and total destruction, a ceasefire in Gaza has finally been reached. And we celebrate the end of this horror, but at the same time we really must make sure that this fragile peace lasts. We need to ensure speedy massive and unhindered humanitarian assistance, including from UNRWA, a full military withdrawal from Gaza and a quick start of the reconstruction. Any violation of this agreement must be met with the firmest consequences, including sanctions. But the agreement can only be effectively implemented if international law is a solid basis. There is no place for impunity. To hold the perpetrators accountable, we must cooperate with the ICC and its arrest warrants, and the ICJ ruling must lead the EU's policies. Genuine peace and independence of Palestine requires that we safeguard the borders of 1967 and end the illegal occupation. Make sure that the Palestinian people can finally enjoy their right to self-determination and live in peace, freedom and dignity.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Our next speaker is Mr. Kenneth.
Thank you, Voorzitter.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, finally a ceasefire. After 15 months and more than 50,000 dead, of which 70% are women and children, finally the people in Gaza can breathe freely and humanitarian aid can enter the Strip. The European Union is happy with the ceasefire, but the EU has done nothing to bring about this ceasefire, nothing to stop the killing, and we have to realize that a ceasefire is still not yet peace. The ceasefire was achieved thanks to a worldwide mobilization of solidarity with Palestine. Is the EU now going to make a contribution to bringing an end to the fighting? In that case, it has to impose sanctions on the Israeli government. It has to stop delivering weapons. The EU has to bring the war criminals to the International Criminal Court, and illegal occupation has to be ended. What are you waiting for?
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Our next speaker is Mr. Papadakis.
Η εκεχηρία στη Γάζα είναι εύθραστη.
The ceasefire in Gaza is fragile. The aggression of the occupier state of Israel is ongoing. The crimes of genocide against the Palestinian people are continuing. So you can't say that the change of president in the US is a factor in favor of peace. The pistol remains pointed at their head of the Palestinian people. Even this truce is the result of their heroic resistance and the incredible wave of solidarity from around the world that was able to undermine all of the Euro-Atlantic propaganda. This has exposed the EU, the Greek government and other political forces that want to see stronger relations with Israel. The Palestinian people has a right to a homeland. All states, such as the Greek state, has to do their bit to support the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital. Thank you very much. Well, the masks have fallen from the so-called freedom fighters, along with all of those who have been claimed to be innocent civilians. They surrounded the young women who were driven away from Hamas's grip yesterday like hyenas. The masks have fallen from the so-called human rights organizations like the Red Cross that didn't lift a finger to help the innocent hostages. And those who talk about a two-state solution but welcome the release of the terrorists from Israeli jails. The masks have fallen from the West's spineless politicians, activists, journalists and corrupted legal institutions that have forced Israel to do a deal with the devil where the pressure should have been put on Hamas to release the hostages immediately or else. As a result of our indifference, the borders of the acceptable seem to have moved. When nothing is sacred anymore, we've taken a 9-month-old baby hostage, And more people still seem to be upset by Israel's defense rather than Hamas's sadism. It seems that the main issue is being forgotten about. We should be happy about the hostages coming home, but we cannot be happy with this. If this was 1945, we would never accepted promises from Hitler about releasing a couple of Jews from Auschwitz, some of them in the form of ashes, and at the same time releasing thousands of prisoners of war, hoping that the Nazis miraculously could have changed. Hamas has to be eliminated as an idea and an organization. The question is whether we're capable of responding robustly now that the masked monsters have let down their masks, stamping on Red Cross ambulances and on Western values.
Card from Mr. Saramo. Do you accept it?
Yes.
Mr. Saramo, you have 30 seconds.
Microphone for the speaker, please.
Can you hear it?
President, the killing didn't start with the Hamas terrorist strikes. Do you know how many Palestinians Israel killed every year before the Hamas strikes? Do you know how many people, ordinary civilians, are held by Israel? Do you know that the far right in Israel has never adopted the one-state solution where everybody has rights, or the two-state solutions? Netanyahu has done everything to prevent peace and the two-state solution, and and supported Hamas. Did you know that?
Well, the point here is that this is a conflict with long roots. And it gets worse every time Israel is forced to negotiate with terrorists of all different types. This is a conflict that will not end as long as the other side does not recognize Israel's right to exist. That is the basis of a two-state solution. As long as the Palestinians vote for governments that use civilians as hostages and take Israeli hostages, there will be no peace. If you want peace, you have to combat Hamas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. La señora Temido.
Thank you, Chair.
24 hours have passed since the start of the ceasefire in Gaza, and we don't know how long this hope will last, but we are happy to see the release of the 3 Israeli hostages and the 90 Palestinian prisoners. Today is the start of a new phase that will need both parties to show restraint. This is a fragile peace agreement that may be broken. It's a step forward that those who've been arbitrarily detained in Israeli prisons are being released. And we need humanitarian aid and the support of UNRWA. But this is a temporary pause, and we can't forget to deal with the roots of the conflict. We need to support the reconstruction of Gaza, respect for the decisions of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. It's time to repair what can be repaired and to sketch out the solution for the future. The EU has to be present, not only with financial assistance, but also as an active party searching for a political solution in the framework of the United Nations. In the EU, we have to start by getting an agreement within this House. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Madame Fries.
The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas has led to hope in Gaza so that people can sleep in peace with no air alarms. The civilian population can support their family members and all the people who have been lost in the ruins, and mothers can hug their children. But this ceasefire doesn't mean peace. It's a first step in the struggle for a two-state solution of free Palestine. 70% of Gaza is is in ruins, and there's a huge need for humanitarian aid. And so the ceasefire is necessary but fragile. It's a chance, it's a first step of peace, but I fear that the hope might be snuffed out as quickly as it has arrived. That's why in the EU we must make sure we should work for a two-state solution until we reach it, rather than giving up in the face of all the unsolved questions. A two-state solution is the only way we can reach peace. I think we should act now, and I think that I know which side of history the EU should be on.
La palabra. Mr. Asens has the floor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. Unfortunately, I don't share the optimism that some of you have expressed. This is not a peace agreement. It's not the end of the violence, the apartheid, the ethnic cleansing, the occupation. It's not even a permanent ceasefire. It is just a pause in the midst of a living hell. Without reparation and justice, without Netanyahu being arrested and judged, there will be no peace. Of course, it's a relief, but this is shameful that it wasn't signed earlier. In the meantime, thousands of people have been killed, and we didn't do anything to stop that happening. And there's a lot of skepticism because we know Netanyahu doesn't want peace. He just wants to win back a little bit of popularity, rearm, gain a bit more time, and continue with the annexation of the West Bank and the genocide in Gaza, where he's exterminated nearly 10% of the population. And Netanyahu won't stop until the US and Europe stop giving him financial and military and political support, until we carry out the demands of the International Criminal Court and the most basic demands of humanity. Before that happens, there will be no peace.
Muchas gracias, señora Sens. A continuación, la señora Serra Sánchez.
El genocidio no empezó el 7.
The genocide didn't begin on the 7th of October, and unfortunately it doesn't end now, because the aim of the Israeli government is the extermination of the Palestinian people. Netanyahu and his security minister need to be judged for genocide and war crimes. 15 months during which Gaza has been flattened. Please speak a little bit more slowly, says the President. 15 months during which Israel has flattened Gaza thanks to unconditional support for it. 15 months during which humanitarian aid was rotting in the trucks while arms and weapons were getting in and assassinating women and children. The ceasefire is not our work, but this is our work. You could have stopped the genocide through exerting influence through your governments in Europe, but instead we supported the genocidal Israeli government. And now are we going to carry on supporting Netanyahu? What will we tell future generations? Who will write the history books? How will you explain your actions or inactions? This photo is the symbol of the cruelty, the collapse of European values, and the collapse of international law. We will continue to support Palestine until Palestine is free. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora Serra. Our next speaker is Madame Firmini.
Well, the good news is that finally there's a ceasefire in Gaza, and the first Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners have been released. But the horrible truth, however, is that negotiations opened the possibility of a ceasefire back in December 2023 on pretty much identical conditions. But these were torpedoes by the US, Germany, and the European Union. Mrs. Baerbock said it's not the politicians' job to create a ceasefire. What a shameful moment. The Gaza war has cost 45,000 odd Palestinian lives. The West is co-responsible for this because there's been support from the US and Germany for the right-wing extremist Netanyahu. My party, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, is calling for an end to weapons deliveries to Israel and a political solution including an independent Palestine in 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital.
Dear colleague, our next speaker is Madame Sofko.
Thank you. Dear President, dear colleagues, the agreement is a significant result of a joint effort by outgoing and incoming US administration with Egyptians and Qatari partners. It shows once again that when the United States accepts to play its role fully on the global stage, it bears fruit. We have seen pictures of happy families reunited with their loved ones. However, many more are waiting in a state of unmeasurable fear to find out about the fate of remaining hostages. The deal must be implemented, hostages must be returned home, and essential aid to Gaza must go unhindered. As we are preparing to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza, the EU should question itself and think about its role in fostering a permanent peace. The priority is that the Palestinians put the power back in the hands of the authorities that must be democratically elected. Palestinians should not be ruled by terrorist group Hamas, who can only brought tears on both sides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Our next speaker is Madame Annunziata.
Thank you. In those very hours in Gaza, thousands of people are hanging between hope and despair, both Israeli and Palestinian. It is our duty for us, all of us, beyond the ideology, as the MEP and as human beings, help the short truce to become a real peace. Allow me to appeal to our High Representative. Mrs. Callas, Europe on the issue of the Middle East has been passionate but distant. Our effort to build peace has been almost non-existent. This is the time to make amends. Let's start with the humanitarian project, Mrs. Callas, a project large, generous, that will define your entire mandate. I believe that this Parliament has the intelligence, the passion and the means to help two populations survive with the right effort.
Grazie, signora Annunziata. Our next speaker is Madame Al-Salani.
For 470 days, the laughter of the children on the streets of Gaza have been replaced by bombs. Netanyahu has mass murdered over 40,000 Palestinians, leading to an arrest warrant by the ICC. But now we have a ceasefire that is very much welcome, leading to silencing the weapons, loved ones, both hostages and detainees, coming home to their families. This ceasefire must become a sustainable peace. Netanyahu and his extremist government must understand that if it's peace and security they want for the Israeli people, then they should not be bombing Palestinians or the neighboring countries. If it's peace and security Netanyahu wants for the Israeli people, it is by fulfilling the human rights of the Palestinian people. If it's peace and security Netanyahu and the Knesset want to build for the Israeli people, it is to stop the ban on UNRWA. And UNRWA is the only trusted and respected international organization by the Palestinians, both in Gaza, the West Bank, and the occupied territories. The needs of education for children and healthcare are overwhelming. It will take more than 350 years to rebuild Gaza. Netanyahu, you have 11 days to find a solution. And if the EU will do one thing right, it is to keep the pressure on Netanyahu to lift the ban on UNRWA.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Our next speaker is Madame Conquet. You have the floor.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, President. Well, we all know that a ceasefire cannot somehow remedy decades of occupation, destruction, broken families. A ceasefire will not reawaken the dead. A ceasefire cannot cure hatred among human beings. Some people say that we just want to put an end to this indiscriminate killing. We want peace, but these people also need to rebuild Gaza and create the preconditions for life in Gaza. We have to put an end to Israel's illegal occupation. We need to fight for a two-state solution. This is the only way forwards if we want freedom and security for Palestinians and for Israel. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Madame Anderson.
President, the ceasefire will hopefully mean a moment of respite in the human suffering, a chance for people to be in security and an opportunity to bring humanitarian aid to the Gazans who desperately need it. The release of prisoners is an important step forward. But the ceasefire doesn't mean peace, and it doesn't bring justice. It won't bring back the tens of thousands of people who have lost their lives in the genocide in Gaza. The reconstruction of homes, schools, hospitals and roads will be a huge task. The countries of the EU are also responsible for the crimes going on for so long. Now it is the responsibility of the EU countries to ensure that all those guilty of war crimes are brought to justice. But that's not enough. Human rights and the right of self-determination for the Palestinians must be implemented in full, and Israel must end its illegal occupation of Palestinian areas. Without those, there will be no just and lasting peace.
Madame Anderson, nuestro siguiente orador es...
Our next speaker is Ambassador Pascual de la Parte.
Muchas gracias, presidente. Ayer fue un día...
Thank you. Yesterday was a day of happiness and peace for the Middle East, but of course it's a fragile ceasefire that we have to pay careful attention to. It consists of 3 stages. I hope they will all be carried out, but it is hanging by a thread. All sorts of things could happen. The EU can clearly help achieve the implementation of the ceasefire by giving political and diplomatic support through giving massive humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza who need it, and also beginning a reconstruction plan on a massive scale in the area. But let us not delude ourselves. There will be no peace in the Middle East until there is a permanent and definitive agreement between Palestine and Israel that guarantees the security of Israeli borders, the security of the Israeli state, and a dignified political solution for the Palestinian people. Without that, will be no peace and prosperity. But there'll be no peace in the Middle East if there is not an agreement on Lebanon, which prevents Hezbollah holding the entire country hostage and preventing peace. And we won't have peace in the Middle East either until Syria returns to the path of democracy. So now is the time for the EU to become the driving force to convene a regional peace conference in the area that would include all the countries I've mentioned, whose actors have something to say. The United States, the Gulf states, Turkey, of course, all countries who can help contribute to peace. This peace conference will mean that the EU has to stay united and must come forward with an EU proposal. Let's resolve our differences, let's overcome our difficulties, and let's offer as peace mediators. If we don't, we'll only blame ourselves afterwards. Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Pachin. Thank you, Mr. President. The human suffering that we've witnessed has to be attended to. It must be attended to wherever it happens, but we have to help the weakest first. That's all part and parcel of our culture, our values, and our civilization. We all agree on the importance of humanitarian aid. The tears of despair that we've seen in the eyes of Gazan civilians who've been massacred over and over, and the tears in the eyes of the Israeli families who've finally received back their family members after agonizing captivity. But all of this can only be guaranteed if we have a robust peace agreement. We need to make sure that humanitarian aid reaches all the population without obstacles. We have to give a free hand to the humanitarian organizations, especially UNRWA. And the EU has to work for a definitive two-state solution, devoting all of its diplomatic capacity to this and supporting the International Criminal Court. But above all, ladies and gentlemen, the EU in particular must always lend a helping hand to those who suffer and who call for help, whether they are calling for help in Arabic, in Hebrew, Ukrainian, Spanish, or whatever.
Los acuerdos salvan vidas.
Agreements can save lives, but behind the agreements are the devastated houses, the rubble, the destroyed hospitals, the members of families who will never return to their homes. What has happened in Gaza is a genocide. This agreement will save lives, but too many lives have already been lost. Too many tears have been shed. There has been too much unnecessary destruction and suffering in impunity. From the rubble, above the rubble is a reflection of the world in which we live, where governments kept silent while genocidal acts were being committed. Let's never forget this photograph. Please look at this photograph. Gazans were risking their lives to help others while the Israeli government was prolonging the genocide. All our support to UNRWA, to the Reconstruction process, we need to have a stable and lasting peace, and Israel has to put an end to the occupation, which is the cause of all the evil, the root of the evil, illegal occupation, illegal settlement. Israel has to be sanctioned. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. You have a blue card from Mr. Oliveira. Do you accept that?
Thank you very much, President. Well, we need a solution for the root cause here, which is respect for the Palestinian people, including the UN resolutions, the enforcement. We need respect for international law, particularly the right to self-determination, to have a state. So what is the role of the EU in this regard? What demands should we be putting on the European institutions to make a contribution to enforcing the UN resolutions, to defend the rights of the Palestinian people and the right to have a state? Can we make this real in the lives of the Palestinian people?
Muito obrigada, señor Oliveira.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliveira. Well, it's interesting that you're asking me a question to me and not to the far right, who never replied to this. The EU has been absent. So the Commission has only turned up for the final part of this debate on a historic day where we're commemorating this ceasefire. The EU has to rebuild, it has to help to put an end to the illegal occupation, and above all, it needs to take the legal steps necessary as well, because Israel needs sanctions or punishment for what it has done. This is a genocide. It's not up to this Parliament, but we call for international law.
Madame de Micro.
Dankeschön. Thank you very much, President. Finally, yesterday, that could be read in the various faces across the region, the joy about a ceasefire. But 15 months is what it has taken. You have to ask, why has it taken so long? Why has the EU been silent for so long? Or some countries, including Germany, have sent weapons to the area. Why did so much blood have to be spilled? So many children be murdered? And those children who didn't die, according to a study, say that they wish to die. Every second child in Gaza is so traumatized. Just imagine. And some hours before the ceasefire started, Netanyahu gave the orders to bomb again, murdered more children. All these crimes, war crimes, colleagues, must be condemned. Netanyahu says that he doesn't want a long-term peace. That's not on. We don't want a ceasefire. We want a permanent ceasefire, and for that we need justice for the Palestinians. We must have a Palestinian in the borders of 1967. The member states must do that if they're serious about a two-state solution.
Thank you very much, dear colleague, Mr. Becker.
Mr. President, colleagues, after more than 471 days, finally there is a ceasefire in Gaza, and not a day too soon. However fragile the ceasefire is, at least it gives us hope that we can turn one of the darkest pages of the history of the Middle East, both for Israelis and for Palestinians. There are some positive signals in the region zooming out. The fall of Assad in Syria, the new president and prime minister in Lebanon, the declining influence of Russia and Iran in the area. These are rays of light with the hope of peace. But of course, what about Europe in all of this story? Let's take this fragile ceasefire as an opportunity to work with Israel, Palestinians, with other countries in the region to make this a lasting peace, to ensure that terrorism and extremism never torture this region again.
Mr. Nemetz, you have the floor.
Dear colleagues, after 50 months of bloodshed, at last, Palestinians and Gaza will be able to catch the breath. The hope has been restored also for the families of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, many of whom were detained without charges. I sincerely welcome the ceasefire, and I hope it will lead to a peaceful coexistence and to the establishment of a Palestinian state. However, the peace agreement will never erase the war crimes and more than 47,000 victims. The agreement will never erase the hypocrisy of a paralyzed West, which to this day has not universally condemned acts of genocide. Even more shocking is that just last week, 2 more EU states said they will defy the arrest warrant for Netanyahu. The ACC was not established only for Rwanda or for the Western Balkans or for Putin, but for all war crimes and for all war criminals. History teaches us that the victim can become the perpetrator. So, full respect of the courts is essential. I call for urgent increase of humanitarian aid to Gaza, restoring full operations UNRWA, and the start of post-war reconstruction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, dear colleague, Señora Martins.
Thank you, President. The images of happiness on the part of the Palestinian people after the ceasefire and the images of the 3 released hostages create hope. But nothing is guaranteed. There's still a lot to be done. We have to guarantee that we don't go back. And we cannot allow the continuation of illegal occupation. Trump and Biden are fighting to take the credit for the agreement, but they are both accomplices. Netanyahu remains in a state of impunity despite the arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court, and agreements with Israel remain in force. Israel still has laws preventing the activities of UNRWA, and we need to support UNRWA at this moment. The hope of peace and justice has to be based upon the majority that want to see peace for Palestine. And institutions like this Parliament have to do the right thing.
Now it's time for Maria Walsh.
What lies before us now is a fragile promise of peace. The ceasefire, while essential, is only the first step, and our focus must now shift to 2 key issues: accountability and the long road to rebuilding Gaza. A ceasefire does not erase the wrongs of yesterday, and peace will not take root without justice. As the violence ends, we hope, we must ensure that accountability is brought to the fore. Accountability is the foundation on which a lasting peace will be built, ensuring stability in the Middle East in the challenging years ahead, along with justice for the many thousands and thousands of victims. I welcome the Commission's announcement last week of a new aid package for Gaza, but let's be very clear, this is just the beginning. Rebuilding homes, schools and hospitals must require not just money but strategic vision. The EU, US and UK must lead in investing in the long-term recovery of Gaza's devastated infrastructure. I'm immensely proud of the Irish people's unwavering support for a ceasefire. Even when our critics were loud and harsh, Ireland has stood firm and have every confidence that we will continue to fight for peace. But this burden can no longer rest on a handful of nations. All 27 member states must step forward with real and meaningful actions, not just words. The promise of peace is tangible for Israelis and Palestinians alike, but let's not mistake this moment as an end. This is only the beginning of the work we must all do collectively. Thank you very much.
Madam Wells, you have a blue card from Madam Boylan. Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Madam Riddle.
In the first days in this truce between Israel and Hamas, I'm thinking of the Israeli hostages and their families, and all these tens of thousands killed and those still living in a destroyed world. The hostages taken must be condemned, and we should also condemn the response of Israel, which has killed tens of thousands, destroyed whole swathes of Gaza, schools, hospitals, refugee camps. The assassinations of Isas, if that's not an act of resistance, and also the response of Israel is not legitimate. I condemn those who have the moral bankruptcy, who don't, and that is not a member in this in European societies and in this hemicycle. This truce is fragile, and we must keep the pressure on Netanyahu. Netanyahu has the possibility of restarting hostilities as soon as he wants to. It'll be time for justice and peace. On the side of those who want to find a solution so that the peoples of Israel and Palestine can live side by side in security. The security of one depends on the liberty of the others and vice versa.
Madam Doherty, you have the floor.
President, at the height of the Cold War, US President John F. Kennedy declared that peace is a daily, a weekly, a monthly process, gradually changing opinions, slowly eroding old barriers, quietly building new structures. The ceasefire in Gaza must last. The eyes of the world must stay on the region, and the agreement should be followed by a new, comprehensive political agreement of a two-state solution. And this is the best way to ensure long-term peace. And this opportunity cannot be lost, like we have seen so many times in the past. Other countries in the region, Europe, the US, must be committed partners in this peace process. Political, cultural and financial partners that see us slowly progress towards that two-state solution, because never, ever again should we allow ourselves to witness scenes like the horrific attack on October the 7th, taking hostages of innocent men, women and children, or the subsequent near destruction of the people and the infrastructure of Gaza. Closer to home, colleagues, we must combat the rise of anti-Semitism, because too much of it these days goes unnoticed, and it's now becoming an accepted part of normal discourse, and it sets an extremely dangerous precedent. We must put a stop to it, and do that now. As Europe learned in the 1940s, the 50s and the 60s, and as Northern Ireland learned in the 90s, peace is not something that simply happens. It's a process that requires consistent effort and dedication over many years and decades. UNRWA reports today, for the first time in many, many months, the people of Gaza hear the sound of children playing. That's something we must strive for to make louder and permanent.
Dear colleague, Madam Doherty, you have a blue card from Madam Boylan. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Roten. You have the floor.
President, colleagues, Netanyahu never prioritized it, but hostages are being released again. He prioritized destruction of Gaza, but the killing of Gazans has stopped for now. I'm glad there is a fragile ceasefire, but the only thing that changed since this deal was brokered 8 months ago is finally putting enough pressure on Israel and Hamas to accept it. But it wasn't the EU. I wish I could credibly urge the Commission and Member States' governments to help turn this fragile ceasefire into durable peace through real pressure towards truth, justice, reparations and a viable two-state solution. But I can't. Not credibly. I deeply, deeply hope I will be convinced of the contrary. But so far, European leaders, those holding the EU presidency no less, actively attack the rules-based international order by undermining the position of the ICC. There cannot be durable peace without justice and accountability. Accountability for all crimes committed by Hamas and Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Señor Bugaldo.
Muchas gracias, presidente. Para que as vozes...
For voices to be heard, the guns need to fall silent. That is what happened yesterday in the Gaza Strip. Today, there is silence. So we have seen the hostages released, and we can hope that the suffering of the Palestinian people can be relieved as soon as possible. But this could give us food for thought. 15 months after the Hamas attacks, the idea was that Israel should never be so vulnerable again. But whether we're from the right or left of this House, the Israeli response had costs and will have consequences. The popularity of the two-state solution in Israel is down to minimum levels, and all of the help from the rest of the world will amount to little without this starting point. All too often, there's been indifference, and this has opened wounds across the Middle East. We need to create an opportunity for peace in the Middle East, but also for the rest of the world and Europe. The promise to never forget that every single life has value, wherever you may be born. We should not forget our promise not to forget and to support multilateralism and international law. We cannot have different double standards for those who are our friends and those who are our enemies. We have to remember the value of human life. We have to ensure that the weapons do not speak again and that our voice is stronger. Thank you.
A blue card from Mr. Oliveira. Do you accept it?
I accept it, yes.
Okay. Mr. Oliveira, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, President. Mr. Bugaldo, you talked about the need for humanitarian assistance in Gaza. Well, that's self-evident. The situation for the population there is tragic. But who's in a position to guarantee that? It's the United Nations for Refugees and Works. However, that work is banned at the moment. How can you combine the necessary humanitarian assistance, but the need to insist on with Israel that they go back on their decision to ban UNRWA? Because without them, there's going to be no way to help the Palestinian people. Thank you very much. Well, the decision of the Israeli parliament is a sovereign decision, and we have to live with it. Well, how are we going to live with it? First of all, we have to understand it. UNRWA found 7 members of its staff who had a relationship with Hamas, and they have now been removed from the organization. But the Foreign Ministry wrote a letter to the EU increasing the financing of UNRWA. The EU has been increasing financing for humanitarian aid for Gaza. So I have faith in this union, and I think that we can do useful work within the union.
And last, our colleague Audrey Jordan, you have the floor.
This ceasefire offers the people of Gaza a moment to breathe after 15 months of horror. The task of rebuilding Gaza requires Europe's full commitment to help Palestinians restore their lives with dignity. It is the EU's moral duty. The future of Gaza's 650,000 children depends on getting back into UNRWA schools, many of which lie in rubble today. And frankly, I am disgusted at the diseased mindset that has led some MEPs in this House to undermine UNRWA, with some even voting to defund school books for children. The proposed Knesset law to dismantle UNRWA's operation puts at risk any chance for lasting peace in the region. Too often in this conflict, the EU's silence in the face of injustice has left a shameful echo. Now Europe must show its humanity, support UNRWA, rebuild Gaza, stand for justice, peace and a future for the children of Palestine.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. We are going to jump now into the Catch the Eye. I have 5 requests, and I'm going to attend all of them. First place for Madame Grappini.
Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, I believe that we are all glad that this agreement was reached yesterday. I've seen the faces of all 3 hostages, among whom a Romanian, 31-year-old Romanian. We can hardly imagine how these hostages lived. Of course, we need to condemn the loss of any life, but we must be fair and we must not apply double standards. We condemned Russia for attacking Ukraine, and equally we must not forget that Israel was attacked by Hamas, and in order to have peace in the area, we must all think, from the European Union, the member states, the United Nations, how we can get rid of Hamas and Hezbollah. Unless we eradicate them, unless these organizations have money to prosper, we cannot have peace. It is good to have 2 states, but it's important to think about how we build Palestine, a state with democratic institutions and not a state with Hamas and Hezbollah. In the meantime, we must maintain the ceasefire agreement. Thank you.
Very much, Madame Moretti.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Niman al-Fazi, 35 years old, was living in a tent in the south of Gaza. She woke up one morning to breastfeed her youngest child. I turned on my phone and I noticed that my child's turned blue and was bleeding. I couldn't hear the heartbeat. At the end of December, 6 children died of cold in the Gaza Strip. Children who were already weakened by hunger and exposure to the cold. These are children who no one speaks about. This weekend, we saw the embrace of the returned hostages and the released prisoners. But no one can cancel out the war crimes that we have borne witness to. We need a peace agreement that is based upon respect for human beings and human rights and international law. Let's do this for all of those who do not want to die of cold or hunger in the future.
Our next speaker is Madame Vieira.
Colleagues, in this chamber, we have mourned the deaths of almost 50,000 Palestinians, including 20,000 children. A ceasefire in Gaza, while fragile and imperfect, offers a crucial first step to end this bloodshed. This pause must not be an end on itself, but a beginning of a determined effort to achieve lasting peace. Our societies, governments and institutions have a very heavy responsibility from now onwards. First of all, to ensure that the ceasefire holds. Opportunities for peace are as rare as they are valuable, and we cannot afford to waste this one. Secondly, to support humanitarian relief and Palestinian-led reconstruction in Gaza. And this, let me tell you, cannot happen without the support of UNRWA. They're crucial not just for humanitarian support, but also for services like education and medical care. The Knesset ban on this agency would be catastrophic at this moment, and we cannot let it go ahead. And finally, we have the responsibility to champion a just and lasting solution in the region, a two-state solution, and seek justice for the Palestinian people, safety for everyone in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Mr. Botenga.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. This ceasefire agreement has revealed something perhaps surprising, but something fundamentally true about the Israeli state. In exchange for the hostages freed by Hamas, Israel has been forced to release Palestinian prisoners. Now, I don't know. Some people have said they were dangerous terrorists, but I looked it all up. The Palestinian prisoners who have been released, well, there were 69 women and 21 children. The youngest of those was 12 years old, imprisoned, locked up without a trial, without even charges or a sentence, by Israel. They were, in other words, hostages of Israel. Israel is now a country that also takes hostages, innocent Palestinians. How is it possible that this assembly says nothing about that? How is it possible that we still support Israel, that we continue to finance this country, a country that engages in hostage taking? It's a rogue state, not a democratic state. We have to humanize Palestinian prisoners and call for their release.
Madame Yanovici Sosoaka.
Thank you very much. I listened to all of you and I am absolutely flabbergasted. When you point your finger at Israel, you're anti-Semitic. No, you talk about justice. When a state does wrong, that state must pay. My distinguished Romanian colleague, Mrs. Grappini, has probably forgotten that Romania has recognized the Palestinian state. So Palestine does exist like a state, and it must exist like a state. If it's no longer there, then it means that any state in the world, whenever attacked by a bigger, more powerful country, supported by even more powerful country, could just as well disappear. Please, dear colleagues, we're talking about more than 40,000 women and children, people killed by Israel. I understand Hamas attacked Israel. But who paid for the fact that Hamas could basically waltz into the Israeli territory? Let's not forget, Israel has formidable defenses. You can't just walk in. Where's the justice then? Mr. Netanyahu is the object of an international arrest order, and nobody lifts a finger. I am a lawyer. I'm a legal expert. I want to see justice done. So I request that the European Parliament ensure justice for all. Yes, Hamas must be held accountable, but so do Israel and Netanyahu.
For the catch the eye when it was closed, but he's been so active during the debate that I'm going to give him the catch the eye. You have your minute.
Thank you very much, President.
I think it's absolutely unimaginable to see the violence of the genocidal actions of Israel and that the Palestinian people have been on the receiving end in the Gaza Strip. This temporary ceasefire has to be made permanent. 45 or more Palestinian victims and the destruction of the shelter and health systems, and tens of thousands of Palestinians need immediate responses. What can the EU do to ensure that there's the necessary humanitarian aid, particularly through the efforts of UNRWA, despite Israel's ban on their work? What actions would the EU take to ensure that Israel complies with international law? And when will respect for UN resolutions be enforced? We need to see international respect for the rights of the Palestinian people, which have been unrecognized for decades.
Muito obrigado. The debate is closed.